The sack of Rome in 410 was a terrific blow to the prestige of the Roman Empire. Of course, it was not the end of the empire itself. The political center of the western half of the empire was now in Ravenna anyway. And once the Goths had had their fun with the city of Rome, the city rebuilt what had been destroyed and shook itself back into something like a normal pattern. Nevertheless, the sack of 410 was certainly, if not the end, then the beginning of the end of the empire, because it underscored that there was no practical way to stop any barbarian tribe which took it into its head to rampage across any of the empire's boundaries. Well, the truth of the matter is, a large proportion of the armies which would have been asked to stop any barbarian invasions were largely composed of barbarians themselves by this point. In North Africa, the local Roman garrisons, feeling the grip of things at the center faltering, gradually turned into independent police forces, with the commanders assuming informal titles like Dux Bellorum, warlord. In 430, a barbarian tribe, the Vandals, under the rule of their king, Genseric, crossed into North Africa from Spain and cut a swath of destruction right up to the gates of Hippo Regius. Augustine died that summer while the Vandals were laying siege to Hippo Regius. And after his death, the Vandals finally overran the town and burned it. They then swept on to Carthage, capturing the old Punic city in 439 and extracting recognition from the empire as an independent kingdom in North Africa. As much as this brought the sword right over the head of the old Roman provinces around the western Mediterranean, it produced little more than a yawn at the other end of the Mediterranean, in Constantinople. From the 400s onward, the empire had been administratively divided into eastern and western halves, each with its own emperor. And this had finally become the solution everybody thought they were happy with in making the empire run. So although the fiction of a single empire remained, it really functioned almost as two separate empires. The Western Empire, speaking Latin and governed by its emperor from various places around Italy, and the Eastern Empire, predominantly speaking Greek and governed from Constantinople. And of the two, the Western Empire was by far in the more perilous situation. This fiction of two linked empires really could not go on forever, and it didn't. Finally, in 476, a coup hatched by barbarian mercenaries under Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus as the Western emperor. Odoacer sent the ancient legionary standards and other imperial regalia to the Eastern emperor in Constantinople, Zeno, with the flippant observation that the empire needed only one emperor after all, that Zeno should keep the relics with him in Constantinople and delegate the rule of Italy to Odoacer as mercenary-in-chief in the West. In the midst of this collapse, the Christian churches were left standing as the only working institutions to survive the barbarian conquests. The Roman legions could not beat the barbarians into becoming Romans, but the Roman missionaries were wonderfully adept at converting them into Christians. The Goths were already Christianized by the time they invaded Italy. After that, the first major conversion was that of Clovis, the king of the Franks, in 499. By the end of the 600s, even the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain had been converted to Christianity. Conversion served many purposes, barbarian and Christian alike. But it also required a substantial expenditure of Christian energies which were consequently not available in the West to devote to literature. What was worse, the Latin-speaking Christians of the West still retained a profound suspicion of the identification of Christianity and empire forged by Eusebius and the Greek-speaking Christians of the Eastern Empire. And they were just as determined that paganism, whether the paganism of the ancients or the paganism of the forest gods of the barbarians, should have nothing to say to Christians worth hearing. Gregory the Great, who became Bishop of Rome in 590 and built the office of Roman pontiff into a major administrative bureaucracy, was a man of great talents, great drive, terrific shrewdness. But he was also intellectually credulous, and he harbored a fundamentalist suspicion of excessive book learning. When he discovered that a bishop had been encouraging instruction in Latin grammar by using ancient classical texts, Gregory sharply rapped his intellectual knuckles. The praises of Christ cannot find room in one mouth with the praises of Jupiter, Gregory warned. Do not apply yourself to trifles and secular literature, or permit your heart to be stained with the blasphemous praises of the abominable. The bad news, then, was that as scholarship in general declined, in the face of the people's raw need to survive, as well as the Western Church's diversion of so much of its resources into Christianization, interest in classical scholarship declined precipitously. And along with it, so did the writing of history. If anything, what we see in these so-called Dark Ages was a regression from history writing into the genres we spent so much time examining in the first lecture, the pre-historical genres of annals, chronicles, lists, and records, epic poetry, even a genre which comes very close to resembling biblical writing, that of hagiography, the lives of the saints. The good news, however, is that, Dark Ages or not, a very great deal of this sort of prehistorical writing got done, much of it anonymously, and a lot of it quite good on its own terms. The Christian monasteries that dotted Western Europe, which often became islands of cultural survival in the tide of barbarian invasion, were great manufacturers of records, lists, annals, and chronicles. In the British Islands, for instance, the Irish monasteries held some of the richest collections of annals and chronicles. The Annals of Innisfallen, the Annals of Ulster, the Annals of the Four Masters. But the Welsh also preserved an Annales Cambriae, the English, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and the French, the Grande Chronique de France. Other monastic annals are just that, annals of monasteries, like the Memorials of St. Edmund's Abbey by Jocelyn of Brakeland. The greatest of these monastic histories is also the most ambitious, the History of the English Church and People by the Saxon monk Beda, or Bede, the Venerable Bede, as he's sometimes known, who began his story of the triumph of Christianity with Julius Caesar's invasions of Britain in 55 and 54 BC, and ended it with the submission of the Saxon kingdoms to Christianity and the installation of an archbishop for Britain who was in submission to the Pope of Rome. The anonymous compilers of these annals and chronicles often read with all the verve of an almanac, the singular exception being the Venerable Bede. But it has to be said in defense of the annalists and chroniclers that, since most of them were monks, the great political and military events swirling around them were a subject of mild indifference to them. The Dark Ages were, however, a great age of biography, which I think reflects how much, like Augustine's Confessions, people had begun to lose hope in discerning the larger patterns of events and had begun to turn to individual lives as a better key to understanding how to live and survive. Many of these biographies are portraits of bishops and monks, because this is the genre which became known as the Lives of the Saints. And they reach back for models to the great biography of the Egyptian monk St. Anthony, written by his contemporary, the theologian and bishop Athanasius. This was a book which Athanasius wrote as a model for true Christian life, in distinction to the life you might find in the pagan cults or in a variety of Christian sects. The summit of these Lives of the Saints is Admair's biography of St. Anselm of Canterbury, the Vita Anselmi, written in the 1120s, which is a paean of praise to the sanctity and humility of Anselm as a Christian, and may we all read and profit thereby. For instance, when Anselm is informed of his election as a bishop, he throws himself at the feet of the messengers, crying, "Nolo episcopari," I do not want to be a bishop, only to have the messengers throw themselves down beside him and weep and wail that he must accept, which he does. And Admair's was only one of hundreds of such Lives of the Saints. Some of them are quite literally lives, in that they are books teeming with short biographical sketches of the sort that we find in the Frankish Vitae Sanctorum, the English Nova Legendae Angliae, and the Welsh Vitae Sanctorum Britanniae. But other Lives of the Saints, like Admair's, are freestanding biographies of the greatest among the holiest, such as the Life of Ambrose by his secretary Paulinus, the Life of St. Patrick by the 10th century martyr Probus, and Bede's own Life and Miracles of St. Cuthbert. At their best, like Admair and Paulinus, these Lives of the Saints, these saints' biographers, are straightforward, not given to flummery, and they really do try their very best to keep choirs of angels from putting in gratuitous appearances. But even at its best, medieval biography is uncritical, except as a pose to make the saint appear even holier. And they share little common ground with the ironic presentations of the follies of the emperors that we find in biographers like Suetonius and Plutarch. Some of the others among the authors of Lives of the Saints make no attempt whatever at discernment. And sometimes the Lives of the Saints seem like tales from the Arabian Nights, such as the story from the Life of St. Brendan, which has that Irish monk and his colleagues setting out westwards across the Atlantic in a cockboat and stopping to celebrate Easter Mass on an island, which turns out to be an enormous whale. Biographers of secular princes and rulers, however, acknowledge that their efforts were not greeted with anything like the same interest as the Lives of the Saints. When Einhard, a German member of the court of the Frankish king Charlemagne, tried to write a classical biography of Charlemagne in the 830s, he expected from the start to get little thanks for it. There were few people capable of reading what he wrote. In fact, Charlemagne himself was only semi-literate. And most of those who could read were monks who had scant patience with classical pagan literature. I have been careful not to offend by a prolix style those minds which are offended by everything modern, Einhard began sarcastically. If one can possibly avoid offending by a new work men who seem to despise also the masterpieces of antiquity. But he plunged ahead with his story, convinced in equal portions that no man can write with more accuracy than I of events that took place about me, and that I would rather commit my story to writing and hand it down to posterity than to suffer the most glorious life of this most excellent king to be wrapped in the darkness of oblivion. No lessons in humility from Einhard. And the rationale for writing his Life of Charlemagne, saving the memory of his king from forgetfulness because of his greatness, was modeled perfectly on Herodotus and Thucydides, and scant thanks he got for it. The regression to annals and the diversion of biography to providing didactic examples of Christian life should not blind us to the mountain peaks of history writing in the early Middle Ages, which did manage to get written. Like the lives of the saints, many of these histories waver unsteadily around their subjects, like drunks who never fall down. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a Historia Regum Britanniae, the history of the kings of Britain, in the first half of the 1100s, which has continued to puzzle researchers to this day, wondering whether Geoffrey was simply a gullible codger who was seriously trying to write a history of Britain from its first settlement, or whether his Historia was in fact a gigantic hoax bent on satirizing classical history writing. He does, after all, link the settlement of Britain to the Trojans, just as Livy does the founding of Rome. He introduces King Arthur as a medieval-style emperor who conquers Norway and Denmark, and brings on stage the magician Merlin as Arthur's sponsor and advisor. I should say that, hoax or not, Geoffrey's Arthur is the real beginning of the great cycles of Arthurian legends, which grow to include Lancelot, Galahad, Camelot, the sword Excalibur, and the suggestion that King Arthur established an overseas empire for Britain will come back at the time of the Protestant Reformation to serve as the basis for Henry VIII's contention that he was not subject to the Pope. More about that in Lecture 12. On the other hand, though, there is Gregory of Tours' History of the Franks and William of Malmesbury's Deeds of the English Kings and his Historia Novella, the latter two being the first serious works of history to be written after the Normans invaded England in 1066 and overturned the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Historia Novella is a compact history of the civil war in England between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda in the mid-1100s, a civil war which bitterly divided the country and turned anarchy loose across England. I should say also that it's this which provides the background for the modern mystery writer Edith Pargeter and her series of novels about the monastic sleuth Brother Cadfael. Well, William of Malmesbury had an extraordinary literary talent. And for being a monk, he evidently had numerous connections in high places, because the Novella Historia represents a genuinely respectable amount of historical spadework, and he had to get the access to those historical sources somehow. But it is still history with a very didactic and very present-minded purpose. As William says in the prologue to the Historia Novella, he wants his book to be a kind of magistrate's court, in which the good and the bad from the Civil War can finally be sorted out in a way they couldn't be while the war was in full cry. William of Malmesbury loathes anarchy, and his Historia Novella becomes the means by which he will impose a just and moral order on it. For what is more to the advantage of virtue, asks William, or more conducive to justice than recognizing the divine pleasure in the good and punishment of those who have gone astray? Of course, he is eager to serve the classical purpose of remembering the deeds of brave men, but he really wants that remembering to take a specific shape, so that following their example, the others may cast off cowardice and arm themselves to defend their country. In other words, I'm going to write this history in order to nip treason in the bud, not to sit by idly and allow the country to be torn in two again. The example I will lay out in my history, William of Malmesbury seems to say, is the antidote to further civil war. R.G. Collingwood, in his book The Idea of History, wrote that any history written on Christian principles will be of necessity universal, providential, apocalyptic, and periodized. I have to disagree. We see very little in the Christian analysts and historians of the Dark Ages which make much of an aspiration to universality, certainly not the universality that we can see in Polybius or in Livy or in Tacitus. Bede may take us back to Caesar, And Geoffrey of Monmouth may try to take us back to the Trojans, but these are scarcely more than gestures. If anything, the histories and quasi-histories of the Dark Ages are remarkable for their provincialism. Now, true, these historians are, as Collingwood claimed, providential in their outlook, always with a keen eye out for discerning the hand of God in causing this or causing that. But not in the vast, sweeping way that Augustine's City of God endeavored to be providential, in seeing all of human history as a struggle between God's city and the city of man. Now, true again, Augustine imparts a certain apocalyptic sense to history, if by the apocalypse we mean the intrusion into human history of the hand of God as judge to bring human history to an end and begin the reign of the city of God. But contrary to Collingwood's claim, few of the historians of the Dark Ages really have much to say about apocalyptic endings. The Venerable Bede, in fact, comes to the end of his history of the English Church sitting in fine and tranquil fettle under a reliably Roman authorized archbishop. And any consciousness of existing as part of a historical period or succession of periods, as Collingwood said, that is blissfully absent from the Venerable Bede. Collingwood was right, though, to have noticed that apocalyptic history does have some following among Christian thinkers, and did in the Dark Ages, too. But apocalyptic was frequently linked not with people like Augustine or the Venerable Bede, but with the disillusioned and the dispossessed who had become convinced that the institutional church had sold the real article of Christianity down the river in its accommodations with the empire first and the barbarians second. Best example I can offer of this kind of apocalyptic history comes from an Italian monk of the 12th century, Joachim of Fiore, who in his study of the Bible became convinced that Augustine had been wrong about history. Human history was not a tale of two tracks, with the city of man and the city of God occupying one or the other. Rather, history is a tale of three distinct periods, pertaining to the three persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The age of the Father was the age of the Old Testament, when things were done by law. The second was the age of the Son, which brought in grace and forgiveness. And the third age, the age of the Spirit, would do away even with the need for forgiveness, because everyone in the third age would be enlightened by the Spirit of God and would automatically live in harmony, light, freedom, and peace. What was fearsome about this third age was the way that it would be inaugurated. At the close of the second age, a great rebellion against Christ would take place, and an antichrist would rise up from within Christianity and persecute the church with fire and sword. God would then intervene by striking down the Antichrist in a great battle, which would end with the destruction of the Antichrist and all his followers and the inauguration of the third age of the Spirit. Unlike Augustine, there is no ongoing struggle between the heavenly and the earthly, only a stupendous final insurgency which concludes with the annihilation of the forces of evil. Although Joachim believed that this fiery end to the second age would, at least by his intricate calculations, occur sometime in the middle of the 1200s, he did not identify who the Antichrist might likely be. But leaving this identification blank only invited others to fill it in. And depending on how dissatisfied you had reason to be, you were very likely to finger someone against whom you had a grievance. And that meant that almost anyone could be a candidate, from the Pope on downwards. Joachim, in effect, put a firebrand into the hands of the downtrodden or marginalized in every Christian kingdom, who were now invited to see a violent rebellion as a work of God and a part of God's plan to bring universal relief to the world. Not as treason against your king, not even as an insurrection against your people, but as a crusade mandated by the Almighty. The great men, both in the church and amongst the laity, will be pulled down, promised the Book of 100 Chapters, a splendid but frightening apocalyptic manifesto from the mid-1400s. Smash the moneylenders, the fat prelates, the price-fixing merchants, the unscrupulous lawyers. Go on hitting them from the Pope right down to the little students. Kill every one of them. Because, according to the Book of the 100 Chapters, only then will the age of the Spirit make its entrance into this newly purged world. Apocalyptic is a puzzling genre for historians to come to grips with. Puzzling because it is simultaneously historical and anti-historical at the same time. Now, clearly, apocalyptic has a vision of what human history means and what its goals and its purpose must be. In fact, the great energy of apocalyptic is its sense that it has a very clear sense of what the goals and purpose must be, sometimes entirely too clear, even if clear only to itself. But packed within that history, that historical sense, is the very clear sense that this human history is marbled with evil and that the evil must be destroyed so that it can be replaced, not with a new round of history, but with the permanent abolition of all those unpleasant features which we have seen thus far in history writing. The abolition of continuity, because you don't need continuity anymore. The abolition of declension, because declension is exactly the disease which apocalyptic will cure. Celebration, who needs to celebrate when the apocalypse has made the third age, or any age like it, a permanent party? Or analysis and criticism, who can possibly analyze or criticize the perfect third age? But if you're not interested in being an analyst or a critic of the perfect third age, what good does it do to be a critic and an analyst of all the imperfection before? Because God's going to destroy it anyway. Take it together, and under the umbrella of apocalyptic, historical events drop out of significance. All attention is shifted to the future, and a catastrophic end, which arrives from outside history, cleaves an unbridgeable abyss between the past and the future. Apocalyptic history, then and now, has as its devotees those who find the past and the present so unbearable that they cannot conceive of the future with any hope unless it involves a radical and traumatic break with the past. Down to our own times, and I suspect for a long time yet to come, the vision of an apocalypse will continue to be irresistible to many people. And in a backhanded sort of way, it will continue to remind us how much our understanding of the present is silently shaped by the expectations that history writing form for the future.